Everyone believed the billionaire's son had been born completely blind. For years, no one ever questioned it. Not the doctors, not the staff, not even his own father. Ethan Whittaker grew up in silence, cut off from the world, hidden away in a huge estate full of shadows. But everything changed the day a new maid was hired. Clara Hayes was not a doctor or any kind of specialist. She was just someone who paid attention. What she noticed during her quiet work around the house would undo years of lies, force a powerful man to face the truth, and uncover something that had been hidden since the day Ethan was born. What started as a job soon became a mission, and what Clara uncovered would shock everyone, especially Thomas Whittaker, the man who thought he had done everything to protect his only child. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know that. Thomas Whittaker was a powerful man in the agriculture business. People respected him for his sharp mind and tough decisions. But behind all his success, Thomas lived a different life at home. He stayed in a large, quiet estate outside Riverton, far from the busy city. Inside those wide halls and glass windows, he lived alone with his son, Ethan. The house was beautiful, filled with expensive furniture and elegant rooms, but it always felt cold and empty. Years ago, Thomas's wife, Margaret, had died in a helicopter crash just days after Ethan was born. That tragedy had broken something deep inside him. He chose to move away from everyone else, not because he wanted peace, but because he could not face the world anymore. His entire life now revolved around Ethan. His son was the only person he truly cared about. Thomas tried his best to give Ethan everything he needed, but Ethan's condition made life painful. From birth, doctors said Ethan was blind. Thomas blamed himself for it, and his days filled with quiet routines, guilt and fear about his son's future. Despite all the money, Thomas could not fix the boy's silence. Therapists had come, tutors had tried, specialists from across the globe had been called in. Nothing changed. Ethan rarely spoke. He did not play. He did not laugh. Most of his time was spent sitting alone near the large living room window, holding a small stuffed bear and listening to faint sounds outside. His eyes, though called blind, always stared ahead into space, never landing on anything. It was like he lived in another world, a place no one else could reach. Thomas often sat across from him, helpless. He read stories to Ethan, sometimes played music, even told him memories of his mother. But Ethan barely reacted. Only once in a while the boy would tilt his head or frown slightly, and those small gestures were all Thomas had to hold on to. At 42, Thomas looked older than his years. His beard had turned grey too soon. His eyes were often tired and heavy, his movements slow, like a man carrying a weight he could never set down. He had grown distant from friends and colleagues, passing more and more business duties to others. He could not bring himself to leave Ethan alone for long. Every morning, Thomas followed the same routine. He helped Ethan get dressed, made his breakfast, and guided him through the day. He tried different ways to connect, textures, smells, music, but nothing worked. Sometimes anger took over. He blamed the doctors, fate, even himself. Other times he sat beside Ethan and whispered apologies, as if his son could feel the guilt in his heart. No matter what he tried, the silence in the estate never lifted. The staff who remained at the Whittaker estate were quiet and discreet. Most had worked there for years, respecting Thomas's need for privacy. They whispered among themselves about Ethan. They spoke about how he sometimes hummed softly at night, or how he reached for the same stuffed bear every evening. But to Thomas, those little details felt like tiny drops in a dry well. He wanted more. He wanted to see his son smile, talk, or show signs that he was present in the world around him. The house itself became a symbol of everything Thomas had lost. It was big enough for a family, but only 2 people lived there. Every room carried memories or promises that never came true. The nursery was still decorated as Margaret had planned. Before Ethan was born, soft colours, animal patterns, and a rocking chair near the crib. Thomas had not touched it since the crash. Sometimes he stood there, staring at the room, holding on to a past he could never get back. Ethan never showed interest in that nursery. He didn't explore. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seem to understand what the room even was. Still, Thomas refused to give up completely. Deep inside, he held on to a fragile hope that something might change. He read every new study on child development, spoke to new doctors, tried different therapies. Each time ended in disappointment. But even with sleepless nights and restless guilt, Thomas guided Ethan through his days, holding his hand as they walked in the garden, telling him bedtime stories with a voice that was both heavy with sorrow and filled with love. Ethan remained quiet, his face showing little expression, his gaze always blank and distant. Yet sometimes, for just a few seconds, he would rest his head against Thomas's chest. Those fleeting moments gave Thomas enough strength to keep going. He didn't know what the future held, but he had made a promise to protect his son no matter what. And so in that lonely estate filled with shadows of the past, Thomas Whittaker lived each day for his silent boy, who never asked for anything. Clara Hayes was 27 years old and had just gone through one of the hardest seasons of her life. She had lost her newborn daughter only weeks after birth. Doctors could not explain what went wrong, and the days that followed left Clara drowning in grief and confusion. She lived in a small neighborhood on the edge of Riverton. She had no partner, no family nearby, and worked odd jobs to pay her bills. One afternoon, while sitting in a crowded waiting room, she saw a newspaper ad for a housekeeping job at the Whittaker estate. Almost without thinking, she applied. Part of her just wanted to escape the silence of her small apartment. When Clara arrived for the interview, she felt nervous but focused. She did not dress fancy, only neat and clean. What surprised her most was that Thomas Whittaker himself opened the door. He looked serious, tired, but not unkind. Thomas had already interviewed several people for the job. Many had good references, yet none had felt right. They were either too chatty, too cold, or too uncomfortable around Ethan. But when Clara walked in, Thomas noticed something different. She carried herself calmly, with quiet eyes. She did not try to impress him. She spoke only when needed. She didn't flinch at the silence inside the house. She looked around with respect, not curiosity, but with something else, understanding. During the interview, Thomas asked about her experience. Clara answered briefly and clearly. At one point she paused and admitted she had recently lost a child. She didn't give details, but Thomas didn't press. That short sentence, spoken softly, made him look at her differently. He saw both pain and strength in her face, and he realized she wasn't pretending. Clara's first day at the Whittaker estate started early. One of the older staff members gave her a short tour of the house and explained the cleaning schedule. The mansion was large, with more rooms than anyone could ever use. Clara worked quietly, moving from place to place without drawing attention. She had learned long ago how to keep her steps soft and her presence gentle. Around midday, she was told she could take a break in the kitchen. That was when she saw Ethan for the first time. The boy sat quietly near the window, holding a small stuffed bear in his lap. His head tilted slightly to one side. His face seemed far away, almost blank. Clara froze in the kitchen doorway, her breath caught in her chest. She had never seen a child so still. There was something about Ethan that touched her immediately. It wasn't just his blindness. It was the loneliness that clung to him. Clara did not speak. She simply sat at the table across the room and took her short break. Even without words, she felt something stirring inside her. This boy needed more than care. He needed connection. In the following days, Clara continued her work carefully. She did not force conversation or ask unnecessary questions. She dusted, polished, swept, and followed the staff's quiet routine. But her eyes often drifted to Ethan. She noticed how he rarely reacted to sound, yet sometimes when she entered a room, he would pause and turn his head slightly. One afternoon, while dusting shelves, Clara dropped a cloth. The soft thud made Ethan flinch just a little. She whispered an apology, though she knew he could not see her. Something about his tiny reaction stayed with her. Over time, Clara realized Ethan responded to soft movements and calm voices. The staff kept their distance from him, careful not to disturb his silence. But Clara felt pulled closer. She did not see him as broken. She saw him as a boy who needed to feel seen, even without sight. One day, while folding linens in the hallway near his room, Clara heard something faint, a small hum. It was so quiet she thought she imagined it. She stopped and listened. It was Ethan, sitting on the floor near the door, humming to himself in a low, wandering tune. Clara did not interrupt. She sat nearby, folding quietly. After a few minutes, Ethan stopped humming. Then he slowly crawled toward the hallway, his small hands reaching for the wall. Clara rose to her feet and extended her hand, saying nothing. Ethan's hand floated in the air, hesitated, then brushed against hers. For a moment, his fingers rested on hers. That simple touch meant everything. It was trust, or at least curiosity. From that day, Clara made sure to pass by more often. Not to disturb him, but simply to be present. Thomas noticed. He saw that Ethan no longer sat only by the window. Sometimes he waited in the hallway or near the kitchen, close enough to notice Clara as she worked. One evening, Thomas asked Clara how things were going. She answered honestly. She told him that Ethan reminded her of someone she had lost, but she wasn't trying to replace anyone. She only wanted to help. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, but he could see Clara was genuine. There was no pity in her voice, just quiet care. That night, after Clara retired to her room, Thomas stood outside Ethan's door for a while. He watched his son sleeping, his chest rising and falling in a deeper rhythm than usual. For the first time in years, something in the house felt changed. Clara's arrival hadn't solved everything, but it had started something new. The following week, Clara was dusting Ethan's room while he sat in his usual corner with the stuffed bear. She always worked carefully, not wanting to disturb him. But that day, as she reached behind a chest, she heard something faint. A whisper. She turned and saw Ethan moving his lips. At first, Clara thought he was humming again, but this was different. He was murmuring words, though unclear and soft. Clara froze. She didn't want to interrupt. She leaned slightly closer. Ethan hugged the bear to his chest as he whispered. His voice was weak, but it was real. Clara backed away slowly and sat in the armchair, watching quietly. Her eyes stayed fixed on him. His head moved slightly whenever there was sound, the creak of the floor, the curtain shifting, the distant hum of a vacuum. He reacted to every sound with tiny, accurate movements, as if he could map the room with his ears. Clara's heart pounded. His reactions seemed too sharp for someone who was supposed to be fully blind. She decided to test gently. She stepped across the rug. Ethan's head turned toward her before she even reached him. She placed a toy on the floor and nudged it. Ethan's body shifted, turning toward the sound. Clara tried again, opening a drawer, tapping her shoe softly. Each time Ethan reacted. Not much, just a tilt of the head or twitch of the chin, but it was real. Was he only hearing, or was there more? Clara picked up a toy with flashing lights and turned it on. A beam of light hit the wall. Ethan did not react. That made sense. But when Clara checked her phone, her flashlight came on by accident. The bright beam crossed his face. Ethan's eyelids twitched. His pupils shifted. Just slightly, Clara's breath caught. She turned the flashlight off, waited, then turned it on again. She moved it slowly side to side. Ethan's eyes flickered as if trying to follow the light. Her heart raced. Could he actually see at least something? She wasn't a doctor. She didn't know how. But the movements were not random. She turned off the flashlight and sat, shaken. Ethan sat hugging his bear, calm, unaware of what had just happened. Should she tell Thomas? Or wait and be sure? The thought of giving false hope scared her, but she could not deny what she had seen. That night, Clara lay awake. She thought about what to do next. The image of Ethan's eyes flickering toward the light burned in her memory. She knew one thing. Something had changed. The next morning, Clara moved through her chores as usual. She dusted the shelves, folded blankets, and kept her steps light. Ethan sat on the rug by the window, his stuffed bear in his lap. He looked calm, as always. Clara wanted to test again, but carefully. She pushed the window open just a little. A thin breeze slipped inside, carrying more sunlight into the room. Ethan turned his head slightly toward it. Not sharp, not sudden, but clear. Clara stood frozen. That was not sound. It was not touch. It was light. Later that day, she tried another experiment. Ethan was sitting in the hallway with his bear. Clara pretended to fix something near a cabinet, turning on her phone's flashlight. She moved her hand slowly, casting shadows across his face. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Ethan's eyes shifted, following one of the shadows. It was small, almost like a reflex. Clara tried again, slower this time. His gaze shifted again, barely but clearly. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't chance. That night she wrote down everything she had seen. She noted each movement, each reaction. The days that followed were filled with quiet experiments. Clara kept testing, careful not to alarm Thomas or the staff. She moved lights, opened curtains, waved objects. Ethan reacted, sometimes only slightly, but it kept happening. The more she saw, the stronger her suspicion grew. He was not fully blind. Something else was going on. One afternoon, while tidying the bathroom cabinets, Clara noticed a wooden box tucked behind some towels. Inside were several small bottles of eye drops. Their labels were old and peeling. Each bottle had dates going back years. Clara picked one up. The words on the label looked unfamiliar. Not the usual allergy or dryness drops she knew. She pulled out her phone later and searched the name in secret. What she found made her stomach twist. The compound reduced eye pressure, but in rare cases it affected pupil response and light sensitivity, especially with long use in children. Clara's mind raced. Were these drops keeping Ethan blind? She put the bottles back exactly as they were, her hands shaking. That night, lying in bed, she thought about what to do. Maybe the drops were necessary. Maybe the doctor had his reasons. But if Ethan could sense light, even shadows, then something had been missed, or worse, hidden. Clara couldn't bring herself to tell Thomas yet. Not without proof. She decided to watch longer, test more, and write down every detail. The next week, she kept close track of Ethan's behavior. She noticed the staff gave him the eye drops every morning without question. Ethan never resisted. He was used to it. The more Clara thought about it, the more unsettled she felt. Finally, one quiet evening, Clara sat across from Ethan with a small flashlight in her hand. She spoke gently. "Ethan," she whispered, "I'm going to shine a little light. Tell me if you feel anything, okay?" He didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. Clara turned on the light and aimed it softly toward his eyes. At first, nothing happened. Then Ethan blinked, slow at first, then faster, as if confused by the brightness. Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. The room was silent. Then Ethan tilted his head, his eyebrows pulling together, and in the softest, weakest voice, he spoke words that nearly stopped her heart. "I think I saw light, Mommy." Clara froze. The word cut straight through her. Ethan had never spoken like that before. Never called anyone mommy, her eyes filled with tears. The grief of her lost child washed over her, but mixed with something else. Purpose. Ethan had reached out in the only way he knew. Clara touched his shoulder gently. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan leaned against her chest, his small body warm against her. For Clara, that moment was everything. It was not just a test. It was a connection. For years he had been silent. Now he had spoken, not perfectly, not clearly, but with meaning. Clara held him for a long time, not wanting to break the moment. She thought about the questions racing through her head. What did this mean? How much could Ethan see? What about the drops? But she knew one thing for certain. She could no longer just be a housekeeper. She had to protect him. Later that week, Clara tried again. She shone the flashlight carefully, moving it side to side. Ethan blinked and followed faintly. Her heart lifted. But before she could continue, a voice burst from the doorway. "What are you doing?" It was Thomas. His face was red with anger. He strode into the room, snatching the flashlight from her hand. "Are you experimenting on my son?" he demanded. Clara tried to explain, but before she could, Ethan stood up. For the first time in his life, he walked quickly toward someone, toward Clara. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding tight. Thomas froze. He had never seen Ethan move like that, never with such purpose. "Ethan," he whispered. Unsure, the boy stayed silent for a moment, clutching Clara. Then, with a small, trembling voice, he said, "I saw a light." Thomas's face went pale. He stared at Ethan, then at Clara, his disbelief clear. He had lived for years believing his son was blind beyond doubt. But now Ethan was speaking, reacting, reaching out. Slowly, Thomas turned to Clara. His voice was low, shaken. "Stop giving him the drops, at least for now." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. The next morning, the routine changed. No drops. At first, nothing seemed different. But by the second day, Ethan reacted more often to sunlight. Clara opened the curtains and watched as he turned his head toward the bright window, pausing as though soaking in the light. Thomas stood at the door, silent hope flickering in his tired eyes. Later, Clara tested with simple cards, shapes drawn in black on white. At first Ethan did nothing. Then he lifted a hand slowly and pointed toward the circle. Clara gasped. Thomas whispered, "He saw that." It was small, but it meant everything. Day by day, progress grew. Slowly, Ethan began to respond not only to light, but to objects. Clara placed toys in front of him, nudging one gently. Ethan smiled faintly and touched it. Thomas stood nearby, speechless. Each new sign gave them strength. Each day brought something new. The changes were small but steady. Clara stayed patient, using simple games and soft encouragement. Ethan responded more often now. He smiled, sometimes laughed, and once in a while even asked tiny questions. One afternoon, Clara placed 3 toys in front of him, a soft ball, a toy car, and a plastic duck. She nudged the duck lightly. Ethan's lips curved in a smile, and he pointed to it. Thomas, standing behind them, didn't speak. He just stared, his eyes wide. "He's choosing," he whispered. Clara nodded gently. "Yes, he's seeing." That night, Ethan sat with Clara by the window. For the first time, he asked about colors. "What color is that blanket?" he asked softly, pointing. Clara answered, explaining as simply as she could. Ethan asked again about other things, his voice hesitant but curious. Thomas stood near the doorway, silent. For years, hopelessness had filled his life. Now he didn't know what to do with the sudden spark of hope. In the morning, as sunlight filled the hallway, Ethan walked toward it without help. He didn't stumble. He lifted his hand, touching the glass where the light streamed in. Clara watched quietly, her chest full of emotion. Thomas came out of his office and stopped. He froze when he saw Ethan standing at the window, his hand pressed against the brightness, the bear tucked in his other arm. "He's not afraid anymore," Clara said softly. Thomas lowered himself into a chair, pale and shaken. "I don't know how we missed this all these years," he admitted. Clara stayed quiet. There was no easy answer. Maybe it was a misdiagnosis. Maybe it was the drops. Or maybe no one had paid close enough attention. But what mattered was progress. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere inside the Whitaker estate began to change. It no longer felt heavy and silent. It felt lighter. Ethan smiled more. He asked about colors, shapes, and simple things like faces. Sometimes he reached out to touch Clara's cheek, as if trying to memorize her features. Thomas, though cautious, started joining them. Instead of watching from a distance, he sat with Clara and Ethan. One evening he brought out old photo albums. He opened one to a picture of Margaret in a red dress. Ethan squinted, leaning close. "Who is that lady in red?" he asked. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. For years he had feared this moment would never come. Clara sat beside them quietly, holding Ethan's hand. The journey wasn't over. They still had questions, but Ethan was changing. And it all began the day he said, "I saw a light." Clara knew the improvements were real. She also knew they had started when the eye drops were stopped. She could not ignore that. One evening, after Ethan was asleep, Clara slipped into the bathroom cabinet and carefully took one of the bottles. She placed it in a bag and hid it in her purse. The next morning, when Thomas was busy in his office, Clara drove to Riverton. She had arranged to meet an old friend, Dr. Emily Carter, who was now working in ophthalmology. They hadn't spoken in years, but Clara had explained just enough on the phone. Emily agreed to help. They met at Maple Street Diner, a small, quiet place near the hospital. Clara handed over the bottle and told her everything about Ethan's reactions. Emily promised to run tests quickly. Days later, Clara got a call. Emily's voice was tense. "You need to come." Clara drove back to the hospital, her stomach tight. Emily met her in a quiet office, holding the bottle and a lab report. "These aren't normal drops," Emily said. "They contain a compound called cyclopentylate, but in high doses. Very high. At this level, it causes the pupils to stop reacting to light. In children, it can even cause temporary vision loss." Clara's hands shook. "You're saying the drops made him blind?" Emily nodded. "If he wasn't completely blind to begin with, these drops would have erased what sight he had." Clara's stomach turned. She asked if it could have been a mistake, a wrong prescription. Emily shook her head firmly. "No, this was intentional. The formula isn't normal. Someone created it to restrict vision." Clara looked at the report. Her eyes froze on the name written at the bottom, Dr. Leonard Graves. Her chest tightened. That was Ethan's doctor, the man who had treated him since birth. "How is this possible?" Clara asked. Emily frowned. "I've heard of him." There were whispers of lawsuits in the past. Families accused him of malpractice. "I thought he had left medicine years ago." Clara sat stunned, her pulse racing. If this man had knowingly prescribed medication that blinded Ethan, then something terrible had been done. She thanked Emily, took the report and drove back to the estate, her hands shaking on the wheel. That evening, Clara placed the report in front of Thomas in his office. He read it slowly. His expression shifted from confusion to shock to rage. When he reached the name Leonard Graves, he stood and walked to the window, silent for a long time. "This can't be real," he muttered. "He treated Ethan since he was born. He told me my son had no retinal response. He convinced me Ethan would never see." Clara explained everything Emily had said, the compound, the risks, the truth. Thomas sank back into his chair. His face looked hollow. "I trusted him. I followed every instruction." "You didn't know," Clara said gently. "But now we do," Thomas nodded slowly. His jaw clenched. "Then we find him. We find out why." Over the next weeks they searched. Old colleagues, medical offices, licensing boards, everyone gave the same answer. Dr. Leonard Graves had left medicine years ago. His license was gone after lawsuits involving children. Families had complained of strange prescriptions and long-term damage. Graves had vanished quietly. Thomas felt sick. He realized he had never questioned the treatment. After Margaret's death, he had simply trusted the doctor. Now he saw how that trust had been betrayed. Clara dug deeper, finding old blogs and posts from angry parents. Some said Graves had avoided court by settling cases privately. The truth was clear. He had destroyed lives and disappeared. That evening, Thomas sat in silence, the lab report in one hand, a photo of Ethan in the other. He stole years from him, he whispered. Clara sat across from him, steady. But Ethan is getting them back, slowly. Thomas's eyes softened for the first time in years. "You saved him," he said. Clara shook her head. "We still have a long way to go," Thomas nodded. "Then we keep going. We'll find him. We'll get answers." From that night forward, the truth could no longer stay hidden. Thomas and Clara knew the truth about Dr. Leonard Graves couldn't stay in the dark. They began gathering every document, every record they could find. Medical reports, old prescriptions, and Clara's detailed notes. Thomas reached out to a journalist he had trusted years ago, someone known for careful and honest reporting. Together they prepared a file filled with evidence. Clara even wrote a statement about her discovery. They weren't looking for fame. They just wanted the truth out, so no other child would suffer the same way Ethan had. But before their story could reach the public, strange things began to happen. The morning after they shared the first documents with the journalist, a new article appeared online. It wasn't about Graves, it was about Thomas. The headline accused him of ignoring medical advice, refusing therapy, and being careless with his son's treatment. It painted him as a cold and irresponsible father. Thomas was stunned. None of it was true. Clara tried to contact the journalist, but he said he hadn't written it. Someone else had planted false stories. The next few days were worse. Clara began receiving strange text messages from an unknown number. At first, they were vague. "This isn't your business. Stop before it's too late." But soon the tone grew harsher. "Stay away or you'll regret it." Clara showed Thomas right away. He wanted to go to the police, but Clara wasn't sure. There was no name, no face, nothing to trace. Someone powerful clearly wanted them silent. Thomas's legal team dug into the fake articles, tracing servers and IP addresses. Everything led back to private networks. Impossible to follow. Whoever was behind this was prepared. The stress was heavy, but it also proved something. Someone was afraid of the truth. While the outside world tried to silence them, inside the Whitaker estate, something brighter was happening. Ethan was changing every day. Thomas and Clara had taken him to St. Mary's Hospital for a full vision reassessment. The specialist confirmed what Clara suspected. Ethan had partial functional vision. His sight wasn't perfect, but he could detect light, shapes, and movement. With regular therapy, the specialist explained, Ethan could improve further. Clara and Thomas set up daily exercises, colorful toys, shadow games, and time in bright rooms. Ethan responded with curiosity, not fear. He pointed to colors when asked, followed moving objects, even noticed when the day turned to night. The change was like a new life. The staff, once quiet and reserved, now smiled more often. The house felt alive again. One afternoon, Clara gave Ethan a set of crayons and paper. She told him simply, "These are colors. Do whatever you want with them." Ethan picked up the yellow crayon. Slowly, he pressed it to the page. The line was shaky, uneven, but it was his first. Clara's eyes watered as she watched. Ethan kept drawing, scattered lines, soft curves. When he finished, he held the paper up. "Is it good?" he asked. Clara hugged him tightly. It wasn't about the picture. It was about what it meant. That evening, Thomas walked in and saw the drawing. He knelt beside Ethan and whispered, "It's beautiful." Ethan smiled wide and began another. Drawing became his daily joy. He explored colors, filled pages, and discovered a new way to express himself. But outside their walls, the smear campaign continued. New stories appeared online accusing Thomas of shady business deals. Another article claimed Clara had faked Ethan's progress for attention. They knew the lies weren't true. But the attacks were constant. Thomas's team suspected why. Leonard Graves, or people tied to him, feared exposure. If the truth came out, lawsuits and criminal charges would follow. Still, Thomas and Clara didn't stop. They worked with lawyers, prepared official complaints, and even met 2 other families who believed Graves had hurt their children too. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just Ethan's story. Graves had left a trail of broken families, but through all the pressure, their first focus stayed on Ethan. His progress was what gave them strength. Ethan's world kept growing. He named colors: red, blue, green. His favorite was yellow. He said it made him happy. Clara continued reading to him, guiding his hands over shapes. Thomas joined them every night. Slowly, the 3 of them built a rhythm, a family-like bond. The estate no longer felt like a lonely museum. It was filled with laughter, movement, and small victories. One afternoon, Ethan carefully wrote his name for the first time with Clara's help. Clara taped it proudly to the kitchen wall. "This is just the beginning," she told him. Thomas stood nearby, nodding. Yes, just the beginning. The world outside could spread lies, but inside, Ethan was proving them all wrong. With their notes, lab reports, and testimonies collected, Thomas and Clara decided it was time to take formal action. They scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. Thomas refused to use his wealth or connections. He walked in like any ordinary father, carrying only determination. Clara came with him, holding a folder packed with printed reports, toxicology results, and written accounts from other families who suspected Graves had harmed their children. They were greeted by a young prosecutor who listened carefully. When Clara explained Ethan's story and said the name Dr. Leonard Graves, the prosecutor raised his eyebrows. "You're not the first to bring him up," he said. That single sentence gave Thomas and Clara a spark of hope. In the weeks that followed, the district attorney's office began an official investigation. Records were pulled, calls were made, subpoenas issued. Then the shocking truth was uncovered. Dr. Graves had signed private contracts with pharmaceutical companies. He had been testing experimental compounds that were never approved for children. Using his position as a trusted pediatric specialist, he prescribed these chemicals to kids like Ethan, without consent. In return, he received money, trips, and favors. Investigators matched product codes from the companies to the same ingredients found in Ethan's eye drops. It was all there: names, dates, signatures. Thomas was furious. Clara was sick to her stomach. They had expected negligence, but this was betrayal at the highest level. With this evidence, the district attorney opened a formal criminal case. The story spread quickly. First, local news picked it up. Child's vision blocked by illegal drug trials. Then national outlets followed. More families began to come forward, parents whose children had been treated by Graves. The public reaction was explosive. Online forums filled with angry posts. Parents shared stories of strange prescriptions, worsening symptoms, and being silenced. Now, with the case in the spotlight, silence was no longer possible. Clara became an unexpected voice for the families. Nervous at first, she agreed to interviews. She told how she had met Ethan, what she noticed, and how small details led her to question everything. Her honesty and calm words touched people deeply. Headlines called her the nanny who exposed the truth. Thomas avoided the spotlight. He appeared only when necessary, giving statements in court and standing by Clara. For him, it wasn't about fame. It was about Ethan and all the children hurt by Graves. Still, something changed inside Thomas. For years he had lived in guilt and silence, trusting blindly. Now he became active, alert, protective. He made sure Ethan received the best therapy. He followed every update in the case. And he looked at Clara with respect, even admiration. Together, They had uncovered what no one else had dared. Meanwhile, Ethan's progress was growing fast. His vision wasn't perfect, but he was learning. He could match shapes, recognize colors, and follow movements in bright rooms. He asked new questions every day. "Is that blue?" he'd ask, pointing toward the sky. "What shape is this?" he'd wonder, holding a toy. Clara and Thomas answered patiently, never rushing. They created a structured routine filled with games, drawing, and reading time. The Whitaker estate, once silent and heavy, now echoed with laughter. Even the staff relaxed, smiling more often. Clara sometimes caught Thomas smiling at her during dinner. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew their bond had grown deeper. By the time the case reached trial, public support was overwhelming. Families lined up to testify. The pharmaceutical companies denied involvement at first, but the evidence was undeniable. Dr. Leonard Graves, who had been hiding in another state under a false name, was arrested and brought to court. The trial became a landmark case in medical ethics. Clara testified calmly, step by step, explaining her discoveries. Thomas testified too, admitting his mistake in trusting without question. The court respected their honesty. Ethan didn't appear in court, but his drawings were shown as evidence of his progress. When the guilty verdict was announced, it felt like justice had finally arrived. Graves was convicted of illegal medical practices, sentenced to prison, and the companies fined. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered. Thomas and Clara did not celebrate publicly. They simply drove home in silence, their hearts filled with relief. That night, Ethan showed Clara a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. "It's us," he said proudly. Clara smiled, tears in her eyes. The road had been long and painful, but they had made it together, and they were just getting started. Dr. Leonard Graves was officially convicted. The court found him guilty of using unapproved medications on children and sentenced him to prison. The companies that had supported him were fined heavily and banned from producing similar compounds again. News of the conviction spread across the country. Families everywhere read about it. New rules were put in place to make sure medical trials were monitored more closely. But for Thomas, Clara, and Ethan, the most important part was that it was finally over. The years of fear and silence had ended. Now they could focus on healing. Thomas stepped back from his business, spending more time at home. Clara remained by Ethan's side every day, guiding him with patience and love. Ethan, once thought lost in silence, was moving forward. With the help of a child development specialist, he was officially enrolled in a local elementary school with a custom plan. It was the start of a new life, filled with learning, movement, and bright colors. The first days at school were not easy. Ethan had never been in a classroom before. Clara walked him to class, where the teacher greeted them warmly. The teacher already knew about Ethan's vision progress and had prepared the class to welcome him. At first, Ethan stayed quiet, clinging close to Clara. The noise and motion of other kids overwhelmed him. But after a few days, he began to adjust. He raised his hand during lessons, answered questions, and joined group activities. He was fascinated by simple things: colors on the chalkboard, pictures in books, the marks chalk left behind. Every afternoon, Clara picked him up. On the ride home, Ethan chattered non-stop. "Did you know blue and green together look like the ocean?" he said once, his eyes bright with wonder. Thomas listened with pride every evening as Ethan shared his discoveries. The little boy Thomas once feared would never engage with the world was now part of it. Months passed quickly. Ethan made friends and grew more confident. His teachers said he showed a special talent for art. Clara often found sketches stuffed in his backpack: houses, animals, shapes, sometimes just swirls of color. Every picture told a piece of his story. At home, Thomas transformed one of the estate's unused rooms into a small studio. Shelves filled with crayons, paints, and paper lined the walls. Ethan spent hours there after school, usually with music playing softly in the background. Clara sat nearby, watching him work. He didn't need direction anymore. He had found his rhythm. Then one afternoon, an official letter arrived. It was from a National Children's Foundation. Ethan had been chosen to receive a special medal for resilience. The honor was given to children who showed strength despite hardship. Along with the medal, he would serve as a young ambassador, encouraging others to never give up. The ceremony would be held in Riverton at a large event hall. The day arrived, and Clara helped Ethan dress in a soft yellow shirt, his favorite color. Thomas wore a dark suit but added a yellow flower pin to match his son. They arrived early and waited backstage with other children who were also being honored. Ethan's name was called last. When he walked calmly onto the stage, holding Clara's hand, the audience clapped loudly. A volunteer placed the medal around his neck. Ethan smiled, proud and brave. Then the host of the event turned to the crowd. "We have one more recognition tonight," he said, "for the woman who stood by this child when no one else did. For the one who believed in light when everything seemed dark. Tonight, we honor Clara Hayes as Ethan's adoptive mother and lifelong guardian." Clara froze. Tears filled her eyes. She hadn't expected this. Ethan turned and hugged her tightly. The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. Years passed. Ethan grew into a confident teenager with clear purpose. He continued drawing and painting, his skills growing stronger each year. His teachers called him focused, kind, and talented. He often shared his story with other kids, telling them never to give up, no matter how dark things seemed. By the time he turned 18, Ethan had been accepted into Riverton Art Academy. He moved into a small apartment in the city, but Thomas and Clara remained close. They visited often, helping him set up his own studio. Ethan began working on a series of paintings inspired by his childhood. He wanted to show his journey, not only the pain, but also the joy of discovery. A few years later, his first public art exhibition opened at Hillside Gallery. It featured 15 paintings, each one named after a key moment in his life. The gallery was full. Friends, teachers, even the journalist who had once told his story, all came. Ethan stood in front of the microphone, nervous but steady. "People often ask me when I saw light for the first time," he said. "They expect me to talk about flashlights, sunlight, or my first drawing. But the truth is, the first light I saw didn't come through my eyes. It came from her heart." He pointed to Clara. The room fell silent. Clara covered her mouth, moved to tears. Then applause filled the gallery. Some people cried, others clapped louder and louder. Thomas placed an arm around Clara's shoulder. That night the gallery stayed full until closing. Ethan's art sold quickly, but people came not just for the colors on the canvas. They came for the story, the truth, love, and second chances. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Whitaker. No longer the silent boy hidden in shadows, but the young man who had learned to see. The story of Ethan's journey spread far and wide. His exhibition at Hillside Gallery brought attention not only to his art, but also to the long battle behind it. Newspapers wrote about him. Local television aired interviews. For many, Ethan became a symbol of hope, proof that even in darkness, light could be found. But at home, life was quiet again. Thomas and Clara were grateful for it. The estate, once cold and silent, now echoed with laughter and music. Ethan often worked late into the night in his small studio, painting with a steady hand, his mind lost in colors. Clara would peek in sometimes, bringing him tea, smiling at the way he leaned close to his canvas. Thomas spent more time with them too. He had retired early from the business world, giving his attention fully to his family. He still carried guilt for trusting Dr. Graves, but watching Ethan grow stronger helped ease that burden. Clara also felt her life changing. For so long she had carried the weight of losing her baby, but now with Ethan by her side, the pain had softened. She had found new purpose, Ethan thrived at Riverton Art Academy. His professors praised his unique way of seeing the world. He combined colors in ways that surprised them, blending shades to create emotions on canvas. He spoke in class more confidently, telling others about his process. His classmates admired his honesty. Still, Ethan never forgot where he came from. In his free time, he volunteered at children's hospitals. He brought crayons and paper, sitting with kids who were sick or lonely. He told them, "Drawing helped me. Maybe it can help you too." Clara often joined him, watching proudly as Ethan encouraged others. She knew he wasn't just an artist, he was a voice of comfort. Years passed quickly. Ethan's work grew more recognized. He was invited to show his paintings in larger galleries. Critics wrote about his ability to capture feelings, calling his art emotional and alive. Through it all, he stayed grounded. He returned to the Whitaker estate often, spending weekends with Clara and Thomas. The three of them still ate dinner together, shared stories, and laughed over small things. One summer evening, Ethan sat outside on the porch, sketchbook in his lap. Clara joined him, watching as he drew the horizon. The sunset spilled across the sky in gold and orange. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "when I was little, I thought the world was empty, just sounds and touches. I didn't know it could look like this." Clara's throat tightened. "You've come a long way," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "Because of you." The words stayed with her long after that night. Later that year, another letter arrived. This time, it was from an international art organization. Ethan had been chosen to present his work at a gallery in New York City. The invitation was a huge honor. Thomas and Clara traveled with him. The city was loud and full of energy, so different from Riverton. Ethan looked out at the tall buildings with wide eyes. "It's like the whole world stacked on top of itself," he said with a laugh. The exhibition was a success. People from across the country came to see his work. Many already knew his story. Some brought their children, telling Ethan he was an inspiration. During the event, a reporter asked Ethan what message he wanted people to take from his art. Ethan thought for a moment, then said that even if life tells you it's over, there's always a way back. You just have to keep reaching. The reporter wrote those words down, and they were soon quoted everywhere. After the show, Ethan hugged Clara tightly. "This was never just my story," he said. "It's ours." Back at the estate, life settled again. But Thomas and Clara knew the journey wasn't finished. The past with Graves had left scars. Some days Thomas still carried anger. Some nights Clara still woke from dreams of her lost child. But now they had Ethan. His laughter filled the halls. His art filled the walls. His future stretched wide open. One evening, as Clara tucked him in during a visit, Ethan said, "You know, I don't remember much from when I was little, but I remember your voice. Even before I could see, I felt safe when you were near." Clara blinked back tears. "You'll always be safe with me." Ethan smiled and drifted to sleep. The house grew quiet, but it was no longer a silence of sorrow. It was peaceful. As the years passed, Ethan's art grew even more powerful. His paintings were no longer just exercises in color or shape. They told stories. Each canvas carried a piece of his journey, the shadows of his childhood, the first spark of light, the warmth of love. People connected with his work because they could feel the truth in it. His exhibitions drew crowds, not only for the skill, but for the hope each painting carried. By the time Ethan turned 21, he was invited to display his work at a national gallery in Washington, D.C. This was the largest stage he had ever stepped onto. Clara and Thomas traveled with him, proud but nervous. The gallery was crowded with critics, collectors, and everyday visitors. When Ethan stood in front of his collection, he felt the same mix of nerves and courage he had always known. He gave a short speech. "I once lived in a world where I thought there was nothing but silence. But someone believed in me. Because of that, I found the light. These paintings are not just mine. They belong to everyone who's ever felt trapped in the dark." The crowd applauded warmly. Thomas wiped at his eyes. Clara held her hands tight together, full of pride. Over the following years, Ethan's name spread farther. He was invited overseas. He travelled to Europe, showing his work in Paris and London. Each time he wrote home to Clara and Thomas, telling them about the new places he saw, the colours he discovered in every city. Back in Riverton, the Whittaker estate remained his anchor. Whenever Ethan returned, he filled the house with stories. He often said, "No matter where I go, this will always be home." Thomas's health began to change as he aged. He moved slower, tired more easily. Clara noticed it, though he tried to hide it. Ethan noticed too. One night he sat beside his father in the garden. "You've carried me all my life," Ethan said softly. "Now let me carry you." Thomas smiled, his eyes wet. "You already have, son." It was true. Ethan had given him back hope. Meanwhile, Clara continued to stand at the center of their lives. She had gone from caretaker to mother, and now to the steady heart of the family. Though she never replaced Margaret, she gave Ethan the safety he had always needed. Ethan's career reached another milestone when he was asked to speak at a conference for child development specialists. Standing before hundreds of professionals, he shared his story. "The doctors once said I was blind forever," Ethan began. "But they didn't see what one person saw, a chance. My mother, Clara, believed in me before anyone else did. And because of her, I see not just with my eyes, but with my heart." The room stood to applaud. Specialists approached Clara afterward, thanking her for what she had done. For Clara, it was overwhelming. She had once thought her life ended with the loss of her baby. Now she realized her life had been reshaped into something she never expected. As the years rolled on, Ethan continued to paint. His themes expanded: family, justice, forgiveness. But one theme remained in every piece: light breaking through darkness. One of his most beloved works was a large canvas called The First Light. It showed a child reaching toward a beam shining through shadows. At its unveiling, Ethan explained, "This was the moment everything changed. When I realized the world wasn't empty, people wept looking at it. Some said it felt like their own story." Clara often stood quietly in the back during these moments, her heart swelling. She knew what the painting really meant. It was their story, hers and Ethan's. Thomas lived long enough to see his son become a well-known artist. He told Clara often, "I thought I had lost everything, but you gave me my son back. You gave me a future." Clara always answered the same way: "He saved us both." One evening, after a successful exhibition, Ethan came home and sat with Clara in the kitchen. He laid out sketches for his next project. "I want to do a series on beginnings," he said. "Because I think everyone deserves one," Clara smiled. "You already gave the world that message." "But I want to give more," Ethan replied. His eyes held the same spark she had seen years ago, the spark that began with a whisper. "I saw a light." Years passed, and Ethan's story continued to unfold like a painting with new colors added each day. He was no longer just the quiet boy hidden away in the Whittaker estate. He had grown into a man whose work touched people across the world. Yet no matter how far he traveled or how many awards he won, his heart always came back to the same truth. The light he had once thought lost had been given to him through love. By now, Ethan was in his late 20s. His art was displayed in galleries across the United States and even abroad. Critics praised his ability to show emotions in color: the sorrow of dark grays, the joy of golds and yellows, the quiet peace of soft blues. But what moved people most was the story behind the paintings. Each canvas carried not just paint, but pieces of his journey, proof of how far he had come. At home, life was slower. Thomas had grown older and frailer, though his mind stayed sharp. Clara had silver strands in her hair now, though her spirit was steady as ever. The three of them had settled into a rhythm. Some evenings, Ethan would return from a trip, throw his arms around Clara and say, "I'm home." And every time she whispered back, "You always are." One winter, Ethan prepared for his biggest exhibition yet. It wasn't in Paris or New York, but right back in Riverton, in a new museum that had been built in the city centre. He had requested this location on purpose. "It all began here," he told Clara, "and it needs to be remembered here." The exhibition was called Light in the Dark. It included paintings from every stage of his life, early sketches made when he first learned to use crayons, middle works showing the shapes and colours he had slowly begun to understand, and now large, powerful pieces that told of struggle, healing and hope. As opening night arrived, the museum was packed. People from all over the state came, families, reporters, art lovers, even children clutching sketchbooks hoping for inspiration. Clara stood near the entrance, amazed by the crowd. She thought back to her very first day at the estate, when Ethan had sat by the window in silence. The memory nearly brought her to tears. Thomas walked slowly at her side, leaning on a cane, but his eyes shone with pride. "Look at him," he whispered. "Our boy did this." When Ethan finally appeared to give his opening speech, the room went quiet. He stood behind the microphone, tall, steady, his hands resting on the edges of the podium. He looked at Clara and Thomas in the front row and smiled softly before beginning. "When I was a child," Ethan said, "I thought the world was empty. I thought it was only sounds, touches and shadows. I didn't believe there could be color. I didn't believe there could be light. But I was wrong, because someone believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." His voice trembled slightly. He paused, then went on. "My father Thomas gave me everything he could, even when he thought he had failed. And Clara, my mother in every way that matters, she refused to let me stay in the dark. She noticed what no one else did. She gave me light, and with that light, she gave me life." The crowd erupted into applause. Clara wiped her eyes with her sleeve, unable to stop her tears. Thomas's hand shook on his cane, but his smile was wide. Ethan continued, "These paintings are not just my art. They are pieces of a story of trust, of second chances, and of love. Tonight I share them not only as an artist, but as someone who was once thought lost. If I can find light, anyone can." When he stepped away from the microphone, the applause shook the hall. People rose to their feet. Some cried. Some held their children close. After the speech, visitors walked slowly through the exhibit. One painting in particular caught their attention. It was titled "The First Light." On the canvas, a small child reached toward a beam breaking through shadows. The brushstrokes were raw and emotional. Standing in front of it, Clara felt her heart squeeze. She remembered the night Ethan whispered, "I think I saw a light, Mommy." Beside the painting hung another piece, smaller but equally powerful. It showed 3 figures holding hands, a man, a woman, and a boy. The colors were warm, the lines soft. The plaque beneath it read, "The family that found me." People stood before it silently, touched by the story even if they hadn't lived it. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, Ethan joined Clara and Thomas in a quiet corner of the museum. "Did I do all right?" he asked, suddenly sounding like the boy he once was. Clara laughed through her tears. "You did more than all right. You told the truth," Thomas nodded slowly. "You showed them who you are." That night was not just a celebration of art. It was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the months that followed, Ethan continued to paint, but he also began writing. He wanted to tell his story in words as well as pictures. Clara encouraged him, helping him remember details from his childhood. Together, they worked late into the nights at the kitchen table, turning memories into chapters. When the book was published, it became a bestseller. Readers from every walk of life connected with his words. Letters poured in, mothers thanking him for giving them hope. Older women saying his story reminded them never to give up. Children drawing pictures inspired by his journey. For Ethan, the letters meant more than any review. "If one child feels less alone because of this," he told Clara, "then it's worth everything." Years passed, and life shifted again. Thomas's health weakened further, but he lived long enough to see Ethan's book inspire thousands. Before he passed, he called Ethan to his side. "You were my greatest gift," Thomas whispered. "But I didn't give you light. Clara did. Promise me you'll always protect her, the way she protected you." Ethan held his father's hand tightly. "I promise." After Thomas was gone, the estate felt different. Quieter, but not empty. Clara and Ethan leaned on each other. They continued the work Thomas had begun, protecting the truth, telling their story, and keeping the estate alive with laughter and creativity. Ethan built a foundation in his father's name, dedicated to helping children with vision challenges. He funded therapy programs, art classes, and medical research. Clara became part of the board, guiding decisions with the same steady care she had always shown. Together, they made sure no other child would be left in darkness without hope. One summer, years later, Ethan held another exhibition, this time dedicated to Clara. The title was simple: The Woman Who Saw. The gallery walls were lined with paintings that captured her presence. Some showed her hands guiding his, others showed her silhouette in light. At the center was the largest canvas of all. It showed Clara standing in a doorway, light spilling around her, her arms open as if to welcome the boy who had once been lost. When the curtain was lifted, Clara gasped. She covered her mouth, shaking her head. "Oh, Ethan." He stepped forward, hugging her tightly. "I just wanted the world to know what I've always known. You are the reason I see." The crowd applauded softly, respectful of the private moment they were witnessing. From that day forward, Clara was no longer just part of Ethan's story. She was recognized as the heart of it. As time moved on, Ethan's art continued to spread. His foundation grew stronger, and his message reached farther. Yet, no matter how much fame he gained, he never forgot his roots. He often told young artists, "Your first brushstroke isn't about talent. It's about courage. Just begin, the rest will come." And whenever someone asked him what inspired his art, his answer never changed. "The first light I ever saw didn't come through my eyes. It came through love." Clara, sitting quietly in the audience, always smiled when she heard it, because she knew it was true. And so, the boy once thought to be blind became a man who helped others see, not just with their eyes, but with their hearts. Finally, as one chapter of this story closes, we leave you with the same reminder that carried Ethan through his darkest days. Light can be hidden, light can be buried, but with love, patience, and courage, it can always be found again.